On a cold day in January of 2017, a 26-year-old man named William Hargrove paced anxiously back and forth inside of his tiny bedroom. Will was nervous because he was about to take the biggest chance of his life. He was about to ask a woman, who he had only known for a few weeks, if she would marry him. Will looked around his bedroom and he saw there was dirty clothes coming out of his hamper and there was fast food trash all over the ground. And so he knew this was not the ideal location to ask someone to marry him, but he also knew he was running out of time. The woman he wanted to propose to, who was sitting right behind him on his bed, was about to head back to Russia where she lived in just a few hours. And so Will finally stopped pacing, he turned to face this woman on the bed, who was just sitting there silently, and Will was about to say something, but then he chickened out and just kept on pacing. To that point, Will's life had been pretty boring and lonely. He worked a low-paying job as a mechanic, and he lived in this bedroom. This was his apartment, this one room, which was being rented to him by a married couple who owned the house it was in. And this house was in a small city in the US state of Oregon. Will didn't really have any friends, and he didn't really have any meaningful hobbies. All he really had was his intense love of science fiction and fantasy. He would lose himself for hours watching movies about outer space and strange, distant alien planets and magic. And then often, after he would watch these movies, he would walk into the forest near his house and he would just kind of wander around daydreaming about these movies, and he would pretend he was the hero from these movies. And suddenly in his mind, Will would become a sorcerer with great powers, or a brilliant scientist who went back in time to save the world. But as much as Will loved daydreaming and fantasizing, what he really wanted was a wife and kids. And so recently, he had joined an international dating website, and it was through that website that he connected with 26-year-old Anna Repkina from Russia, who was the woman sitting on the bed behind him. And now, if Will could just muster the courage to pop the question to her, he was confident she would say yes, and he could finally start his real life with Anna. Anna, who had blonde hair and striking blue eyes, was a bit of a dreamer like Will. For example, she fundamentally believed that there was a soulmate somewhere in the world for everyone. However, to that point in her life, she had not found her soulmate. Instead, she had been through one bad breakup after another. But a few weeks earlier, when a short, stocky, bald guy with a bushy goatee, Will, had reached out to her on an international dating website and invited her to America to visit him, she believed it was fate that they were being brought together, and so Will had to be her soulmate. Will finally stopped pacing and turned again to face Anna, who was now reading a book on the edge of the bed. And Will, who was terrified at this point, took a deep breath and then reached into his pocket and pulled out a jewelry box. Inside of it was a beautiful emerald ring that was situated on a white gold band. And so Will took a step towards Anna, he dropped down to a knee, and he held out the jewelry box and he opened it up. At first, Anna didn't know what Will was doing and was kind of confused, but when she saw the ring and saw him on his knee, she knew what was happening, and she began trembling with excitement. And then Will, he pulled the ring out of its holder and he slipped it onto Anna's finger, and he asked her if she would marry him. And Anna, she began crying tears of joy and shouted, yes. Later that day, Anna would fly back home to Russia, but as soon as she landed, she began getting her affairs in order to go right back to Oregon to live with Will permanently. And 2 months later, in March of 2017, Anna was touching back down at the Oregon airport, and then right near the baggage claim, she had her big reunion with Will. That evening, when Anna and Will drove from the airport to Will's place, they parked the car, they got out, they grabbed Anna's luggage, they went up the front steps, and when Will unlocked the front door to go inside of the house to make their way up to his bedroom apartment, as soon as the door swung open, there was a woman standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, staring out at both of them. This woman was 34-year-old Michelle Chavez, and she and her husband were the married couple who rented the bedroom apartment to Will. Michelle had dark hair and piercing eyes, and even when she was being pleasant, she could be very intimidating. And right now, it was obvious she was not trying to be pleasant. And so Anna, who sensed something was wrong here, kind of awkwardly said hi to Michelle. But Michelle, she just glared at Anna and said nothing, and then looked from Anna to Will and said, "Will, I need to talk to you." And then before Will could say anything, Michelle grabbed his arm and began dragging him through the house to the back. And as Will is kind of stumbling along after Michelle, he tried to be calm and told Anna, "Just go ahead and take your stuff up to the room. I'll be up there in a minute." And so Anna, she's very confused about what's happening here. She does not understand this dynamic at all, but she began taking her suitcases and marching over to the side of the house where Will's bedroom was. And as she did this, she could hear on the other side of the house, Michelle really yelling at Will, but Anna couldn't make out what Michelle was actually saying. And so at some point, when Anna was now inside of Will's bedroom, just kind of waiting, Will finally did come into the bedroom with his head hung down low, and Anna could just tell that, obviously he's just been yelled at, he looks defeated, and so Anna's trying to make eye contact with him, and finally, Will looks up at Anna, and Anna says, "Hey, what's going on? Why was she so upset? What's happening here?" And in a quiet, trembling voice, Will would tell Anna that Michelle and her husband had just told him that they can't live here anymore. They have to move out. Anna couldn't believe this. She had just flown across the world to be here with Will, and now they don't have a place to live. But she could tell, obviously, Will is really upset about this too. And so instead of just being mad at him, she said, "What's going on? Why is she kicking us out?" And at first, Will kind of acted like he didn't really know. But then eventually, when Anna kept asking for more information, he would tell her that Michelle sort of had a crush on him. And when she saw Anna moving in with Will, she became really jealous and told them to leave. When Anna brought up the fact that Michelle was married, Will said, "I know, she's married, the crush hasn't gone anywhere, but she still feels really jealous." Anna was obviously really upset about this situation, but after Will had explained what's going on with Michelle, Anna wasn't mad at Michelle, she actually felt kind of bad for her. It was sort of pathetic that this married woman was acting the way she was. And so Anna actually figured that really this is probably for the best, that we should get away from Michelle. And within a few days, Anna and Will had moved out of Michelle's place and found a place of their own in a neighboring town. And as soon as they were settled inside of there, it was like relief washed over both of them. And they both became really excited to plan their wedding and think about their future together. A few weeks later, on March 25th, 2017, Anna woke up early and put on her beautiful, simple white wedding dress that she brought from Russia, and then she and Will piled into his car and they headed to the beach. The couple had decided to go with a very simple, intimate outdoor wedding ceremony led by an officiant. An officiant is someone who can legally conduct a wedding. When the couple arrived at the beach, Anna hopped out and immediately began walking over the sand towards the water, and Will stayed back to call the officiant because he didn't see him anywhere. And so when Anna reached the water, she took in the beautiful sights and sounds of the beach. She felt the sun on her face and she listened to the sound of the waves crashing. And it was like suddenly she realized how lucky she was. I mean, this wedding day was turning out to be perfect when over the past couple of weeks, she wasn't sure if it was even going to happen. Even though Anna and Will had left Michelle's house and had no contact with her, over the past couple of weeks, Michelle had become a sort of thorn in their side, sending Anna all these really threatening messages, things like demanding that Anna share Will with her, or else she'll do something awful. And so Anna is thinking that Michelle is going to find a way to sabotage their wedding, but here they were on the beach about to get married with no Michelle in sight. And so at some point, Anna looked along the beach and saw a little bit farther along were the two friends that she and Will had invited to be a part of their wedding. And so Anna ran over to them and she hugged them and began chatting with them. And as she's chatting, she looks up and she sees Will coming down onto the beach and he's on his cell phone. And Anna can't tell what he's saying. He's too far away, but it's obvious there's something wrong. And by the time Will actually got up to the group, he had hung up his phone, but it was very obvious he was really upset. And as soon as he reached the group, he would announce to Anna and their friends that the officiant was not going to be able to make it. And so unfortunately, the wedding was off, at least for now. Now, Anna was totally crushed by this, but she could tell Will also was totally crushed by this. And so instead of crying and making Will feel worse, Anna put on a brave face and told Will, "Don't worry about it. We will find another officiant. We'll reschedule this. It will be fine." And so Anna and Will's friends, they said bye and they headed their way, and Anna and Will had a very somber walk along the beach back to their car. But on the drive from the beach back to their apartment, they would stop at a fast food restaurant, McDonald's, and they would get some food, and by the time they had made it back to their apartment, they were laughing about how ridiculous it was that they were eating fast food in their wedding clothes. A couple weeks later, Anna was still in the process of rescheduling their wedding, and she was starting to feel very frustrated with Will. Over the last week or so, Will, instead of helping her with the wedding, was spending much of his time outside of the apartment, pacing around, chain smoking, while talking to someone on the phone. Now, Anna didn't know who he was talking to, but based on how stressed out he seemed, Anna assumed he had to be talking to either Michelle or talking to someone else about Michelle. Regardless, Anna knew this had to, in some way, be connected to Michelle. However, whenever Anna would approach Will and ask him why he was so stressed and whether or not he was still in contact with Michelle, Will would try to change the subject, or he would just clam up and not talk at all. But finally, on April 16th, so 3 weeks after the couple's first failed wedding attempt, Will would approach Anna and ask her very sheepishly if she would come with him on a walk through the woods, because he had something important he wanted to tell her. Now, Anna knew that Will loved walking in these woods. He still went off and daydreamed after his movies, and so she knew that if he's asking her to go out there to talk, that this was going to be a very serious conversation, most likely about Michelle and whatever's going on. And so the couple piled into Will's car and they drove to the parking lot right near the woods. They got out, they hopped on a path, and they began walking into the trees. And for a while, they didn't really talk to each other. They just walked quietly side by side through the woods. But at some point, Will began to slow down and then finally came to a full stop, at which point Anna stopped too, and she turned to face him. And when she did, Will paused for a moment and then with a shaky voice told Anna that he felt like they rushed into their relationship and he wanted to call off the engagement. Anna was so caught off guard and heartbroken by what she was hearing that she couldn't say anything. She just stood there in stunned silence and then finally just turned around and stormed off away from Will deeper into the woods until she was out of Will's sight. The next day, when Will woke up, the first thing he did was pick up his phone and text Anna. But Anna didn't write back. And so as Will is laying in bed, he couldn't help but feel this overwhelming sense of regret about the decision he had made the day before. He wanted Anna back. So, over the course of the next several hours, Will would send Anna a series of increasingly more desperate-sounding text messages, pleading with her to just talk to him, please. But she didn't respond to any of his messages. And so Will decided that the only way he could get Anna back would be if he did something big. So he hopped out of his bed, he grabbed his cigarettes, he went outside, and he began pacing and chain smoking, trying to come up with whatever big idea was going to get Anna back. And at some point, an idea came to him. He would do what he had seen heroes do in several of his favorite science fiction and fantasy movies. He would use time travel to go back in time and get Anna back. Feeling totally energized by this idea, Will ran back inside his apartment, he grabbed another pack of cigarettes, a 6-pack of soda, and then he sat down at his computer and he scoured the internet for any information about how to build a time-traveling machine. And for the next 24 to 48 hours, Will stayed at his computer, chain smoking and drinking sodas, drawing all these sketches of different time machine designs that he found on the internet. But at some point, after 24 to 48 hours, Will realized that no matter how good these sketches were, he lacked 1, the resources, and 2, the knowledge and expertise of how to take this sketch and actually make it into a real physical time machine. And so feeling totally frustrated, Will took a sketchbook and threw it, and then lay down on his bed, feeling somewhat defeated. But as he laid there thinking about Anna, he had another epiphany. In other science fiction and fantasy movies, sometimes the heroes didn't need to use time machines to go back in time, they would use magic. And so suddenly Will decided, oh my goodness, I need to find the right magical spell that will allow me to travel back in time and get Anna. And so once again, he ran back to his computer, continued chain smoking and drinking sodas while scouring the internet looking for the right magical spell that would take him back in time. And several times he communicated with strangers on the internet, telling them that he would sell his soul to them if they could give him the right spell. And then anytime he thought he found the right spell, he would close his eyes and chant the words out loud, and then open his eyes only to realize he was stuck in the present. And so finally, after basically staying awake for 72 hours on this quest to go back in time to get Anna back, Will realized that it was not going to work, and so he gave up. The next morning, on April 19th, so this is 3 days after he broke up with Anna in the woods, Will heard a knock on his front door. And when he opened the door, there were 2 police officers standing there. And when Will asked them, what's going on, they told him that they actually needed his help, and would he mind coming to the station to talk to them. And so Will, he was still totally exhausted from not having slept over the last 3 days, but he of course agreed to go. And when he got to the police station, he was led into a small interview room, and he sat down behind this metal desk in front of the other 2 officers, and he asked them, what can I do for you? And one of the officers eventually asked Will if he had recently eaten at a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant. That's a fast food restaurant also known as KFC. Will was puzzled and almost wanted to laugh because he couldn't understand how this was important. But when he saw that these 2 officers were not making light of this at all, they were very serious, Will said, yeah, a few days ago I did eat at a KFC. Why does that matter? To understand why it mattered, we need to understand the relationship between Will and Michelle. It would turn out Michelle did not just have a crush on Will. Michelle and Will had been having an intense affair right in Michelle's house with her husband since 2015, so a full year before Will met Anna. Now, Will had wanted Michelle to leave her husband and be with him, and Michelle had told Will that she wanted the same thing, but she couldn't do it right now. And so to show Will that she was serious, that one day she would be with him, she gave him her wedding ring, which was an emerald stone sitting on a white gold band. It was like a promise ring, that this is my token to you to show you that one day we will be together in public. But as time went on, Michelle didn't really show any signs of trying to leave her husband, and so Will started to wonder if he was just kind of letting his life slip by. Because remember, Will really wanted a wife and kids, and it was starting to look like Michelle was not going to give him either of those things. And so that was why Will went on that dating site and contacted Anna, and then when he learned that Anna wanted a family too, he had asked her to marry him. The ring that Will gave Anna when he proposed to her was the same ring that Michelle had given Will. Her wedding ring, the promise ring. And so when Michelle saw that ring on Anna's finger on a Facebook post that Anna made about having been proposed to by Will, Michelle was enraged. And then just a few weeks later, when Anna showed up at Michelle's house to move into Will's bedroom with him, she grabbed Will, dragged him to the side of the house, and said, "You need to choose right now between me and Anna." And because Will couldn't come up with an answer, Michelle kicked him and Anna out of the house. However, over the following weeks, despite Michelle having booted them from her property, she could not let go of her jealousy of Anna and her love for Will. And so she sent Anna all these threatening messages on Facebook demanding that she share Will with her or else, and she began incessantly calling and texting Will demanding that he choose her over Anna. And so when Anna saw Will walking around outside chain-smoking cigarettes on the phone, Anna was right in suspecting that that was Michelle that he was talking to. But despite all this pressure, Will just could not make up his mind. He didn't know which woman he wanted to be with more. And so to buy himself some time, he had lied to Anna about hiring an officiant for their wedding on the beach. And then when they arrived on the beach and Will said the officiant had canceled, it was all a ruse. There was never any officiant. He was just trying to buy time for himself. But finally, on April 16th, for whatever reason, Will had decided that he knew which woman he wanted to go with. He wanted to go with Michelle. So he brought Anna out into the woods and he told her the news that he was breaking off the engagement and effectively their relationship was over, at which point Anna turned and stormed off into the woods. And so Will, he watched her disappear, and then he turned around and walked back along the path back toward his car. And when he got there, he opened his trunk and got something out of it, and then he walked back along the trail into the woods where he had seen Anna last. And when he reached that spot, he kind of walked off in the direction that Anna had wandered, and eventually he spotted Anna. She was standing in a clearing, looking up into the sky, seemingly lost in thought. And so Will quietly walked up right behind her, and then he raised the shotgun he had gotten out of his trunk. He placed the barrel against the back of Anna's skull, and before she could even react, say something, turn around, do anything, he pulled the trigger. Afterward, he ran back down the trail to his car, and he gathered up all of Anna's things that happened to be inside of the car, along with some trash on the floor of the car, and then he brought all of that stuff back into the woods and kind of dumped it both on and around Anna's body. The next day, a walker and their dog happened to come across Anna's body, and when the police were called out to the site, they began sifting through all of the trash that was kind of scattered around Anna's body. And inside of a crumpled up KFC bag, the police would find a receipt for the day of the murder. And that receipt belonged to Will. The morning after Will killed Anna, he sent those initial text messages to Anna just to cover his tracks. But as he sent them, he actually did feel an enormous sense of regret about the decision he made. He no longer wanted Michelle, he wanted Anna. And it was at that point that he decided he would do what the heroes in some of his favorite movies did. He would go back in time and undo the murder and get his love back. But of course, his efforts would fail. And in January of 2020, 3 years after Anna's murder, Will was sentenced to life in prison. As for Michelle, she was never charged with any crime. On the evening of Wednesday, May 21st, 1924, a man named Jacob Franks walked up the steps to his mansion, and right as he went to open his door, his butler opened it up, welcomed him inside, and Jacob smiled at the butler and stepped in. Jacob had just spent a long day at his office in Chicago, Illinois, doing a big real estate deal, and now he was just happy to be home with his wife and his 3 kids. Jacob was an incredibly successful business person who had made a name for himself first in the early 1900s when he ran a bank that specialized in giving out these enormous loans to gamblers. But it wasn't until he was named the president of the Rockford Watch Company and he expanded into real estate that he became outrageously wealthy. His fortune in today's dollars would have been around $70 million. But now that Jacob was so well established in the business world in Chicago, he was trying to make a more conscious effort to spend more time at home with his wife and kids. And so as soon as he walked past his butler into his mansion, he hung up his hat and his jacket, and he went to find his wife, Flora, to tell her about an idea he had for a trip for that upcoming weekend. But when Jacob found Flora, she was not remotely interested in talking about their weekend plans, because Flora was very worked up about their youngest son, Bobby. Bobby, who was 14 years old, was supposed to come home right after school, but it was now 6 p.m. and he still hadn't shown up, and she had no idea where he was. And Jacob's reaction to this news was just to feel kind of aggravated. Bobby was generally a really good kid. He was a student at a prestigious boys' school right down the road, and his teacher was convinced that Bobby was the smartest kid in his entire grade. Bobby was a member of the school's debate team and regularly beat the older kids. And Bobby was just a natural leader and very hardworking and kind. But Bobby could also be fairly irresponsible sometimes, specifically in terms of coming home on time. This was not the first time that Bobby had not come home by curfew. So Jacob told Flora, don't worry about it. This is something Bobby does. He likely lost track of time. And as Jacob and Flora are having this discussion, Bobby's older brother came into the room and suggested to his dad, Jacob, that perhaps Bobby was across the street at Richard's house. Richard was Bobby's cousin, playing tennis on their private court. Richard and Bobby were quite close, even though they were 4 years apart. Richard was 18, Bobby was 14, but they really bonded over tennis, and so that was something they did all the time. And so Jacob said he would go across the street and see if Bobby was there, and he also told his wife, Flora, to just continue to call around town and see if anybody knew where Bobby might be. And so Jacob left his mansion and began walking across the street towards Richard's family's mansion to see if his son was there. Now, this neighborhood that Jacob lived in was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods really in the entire country, but definitely within Chicago's city limits. It was called South Kenwood, and basically imagine a street where every house is a huge mansion, and every mansion is home to some business tycoon or famous person, and all the families who lived in this neighborhood had a full staff of maids and butlers and drivers and fleets of private cars. I mean, these people who lived in South Kenwood were literally the richest of the rich. And so Jacob, he gets across the street, he's standing in front of Richard's family's mansion, and he looks around the side and he can see the private tennis court where his son and Richard would always play, but it's totally vacant, and in fact, the house is just totally quiet. No one's home. When Jacob got back to his own home, he found his wife pacing around in the parlor looking really concerned, and so Jacob immediately asked her, what'd you learn? What's going on? And she would tell Jacob that she had spoken to one of Bobby's friends who told her that Bobby had umpired a baseball game after school and had left to walk back home at around 5 p.m. The school and the baseball field where Bobby would have been was only about 3 blocks away from their home, and now it was 6:30 p.m. So it's been an hour and a half since Bobby had supposedly began his walk home. And so by now he certainly should be here, but of course he wasn't. At this point, Jacob went from feeling aggravated with his son to being concerned for his son's safety, despite the fact that he's thinking, okay, well, my son is likely somewhere in this neighborhood in South Kenwood, one of the safest, richest, best places in the country. He's got to be okay, but I really want to find him. And so Jacob would call one of his very close friends who lived in this neighborhood, who also happened to be a former state senator, and he asked him to come over and basically look around the neighborhood for Bobby. When the state senator friend arrived at Jacob's house, the two men left and began walking down the street lined with mansions, making their way towards the school where Bobby supposedly had been umpiring. And when they got there, they saw there was no baseball game happening, and the school was dark and closed for the night. But Jacob and his friend decided that, maybe it was possible that after umpiring this game, when Bobby had begun his walk home, maybe he had taken a detour into the school to get something, and then perhaps the doors got shut and locked on him. And so Jacob and his friend went to the school and looked for a way to basically break into the school. And sure enough, they would find an open window, they'd open it up, they would climb inside, and they would search the entire school, but Bobby was not in there. At this point, Jacob was really starting to panic. His friend was trying to calm him down, but Jacob is now thinking, something is terribly wrong with my son. And so the two men actually ran from the school back to Jacob's house, and when they went inside, Jacob immediately called out to his wife to see if maybe she had located Bobby, but when he called Flora's name, there was no response. And so Jacob and his friend, they run inside and they make their way towards the parlor, which is where they had last seen Flora before they left. And when they walked in there, they found Flora lying on the ground, totally lifeless, with the phone off the hook right next to her hand. And so Jacob and the senator, they run over and they begin shaking Flora, and suddenly she wakes up with a gasp, and she looks up at Jacob and just begins sobbing hysterically. And after Jacob finally calmed her down, she would tell him that after they had left to go to the school, she had received a phone call. And at first, she thought it was Bobby calling to check in. But when she answered it, it wasn't Bobby. It was a man's voice she didn't recognize, who told her that Bobby had been kidnapped. He was safe for now, but if they went to police, something terrible would happen to him. This mystery man also told Flora that they would be in touch soon with more information, and then they hung up. And Flora had been so overwhelmed by what she was told that she had fainted, and that was why they found her on the ground. That night, Jacob, Flora, and the state senator friend stayed up late going over, what they should do. Of course, they wanted to go to police, but this felt like a credible threat that Bobby could be harmed if they did that. And so they just went back and forth over how to handle this horrible situation. But by 2 a.m., they had made a decision. The state senator had some close friends and connections in the police department, and so they decided that they would go talk to the police, but they would swear them to secrecy so the kidnapper or kidnappers wouldn't know the police were investigating. And so, a few hours later, when the police department opened up, Jacob and the state senator friend went to the police. They spoke to the highest ranking officer who was sworn to secrecy, and then that morning, the police would begin a quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping. At the same time this investigation was beginning, on the morning of May 22nd, 1924, a man named Morton D. Ballard drove through downtown Chicago in a luxury car known as a Willis Knight. He pulled this luxury car into a parking lot right next to a rental car company, and after parking the car, Morton got out, he went inside of the shop, and he handed the keys over to the clerk behind the desk. The clerk would ask Morton, how did it go with your rental car? And Morton would say, oh, it was perfect, went totally fine. After that, Morton thanked the clerk, he turned around and walked outside where another luxury car was waiting for him, being driven by his good friend, Lewis Mason. And once Morton had climbed inside, the two men smiled and drove off and disappeared into traffic. That same morning, Jacob and Flora received a letter from the kidnapper or kidnappers demanding $10,000 in small unmarked bills, and if they gave this money over, they would get their son back. And immediately, Jacob went to the bank and got the money, but before he could actually deliver the money to the kidnappers at the location they had specified in this letter, the police, who were quietly investigating, discovered a clue that would break the case wide open. It would take over a week to unravel this bizarre clue, but it all started to come together when the police brought in Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason for questioning. Here is the shocking story that detectives were finally able to piece together about what happened to Bobby Franks. On May 7th, 1924, so 2 weeks before Bobby went missing, Morton D. Ballard walked into a hotel in Chicago called the Morrison and rented room 1031. He would tell the front desk that he wanted them to hold his mail for him, and over the next couple of days, Morton would come in and he would get his mail from the front desk, but he didn't appear to ever actually go up to his room. Finally, a suspicious maid at the Morrison Hotel, who had been going into room 1031 every day to clean it, only to discover that Morton was not in there and the room was totally untouched and clean already, she went in one morning and saw Morton was not in there, and she would actually just open up one of Morton's suitcases that he had left inside. And instead of the suitcase containing clothes or toiletries, it just contained a bunch of random library books. As it happened, after this maid found this strange suitcase full of books, Morton stopped coming to the hotel. He stopped getting his mail, he did not claim his luggage, and he didn't pay the bill. He just kind of vanished. On May 9th, so just a couple of days after Morton first booked that room at the Morrison Hotel, Morton also opened a bank account in Chicago. He also made his first appearance at that car rental company where he asked for the Willis Knight car. The rental company would not just let anybody take a Willis Knight car. You needed a reference to show that you were someone who could pay for this type of vehicle. And so Morton's friend, Lewis Mason, would give him that reference and allow him to rent the Willis Knight car. About a week and a half later, on May 21st, so the day Bobby went missing, Morton and Lewis were driving around South Kenwood in their Willis Knight car when they spotted Bobby by himself walking down the road. Now, Lewis recognized Bobby, and he knew that Bobby was an incredible tennis player, and Lewis had a question for Bobby about a particular tennis racket. And so Lewis, who was in the front seat of the car, told Morton, who was driving, to pull over so Lewis could talk to Bobby. And so Morton pulled over, Lewis rolled his window down, he called over to Bobby, Bobby came over, and before long, Lewis and Bobby were talking about this tennis racket. And then when that conversation naturally wrapped up, Lewis offered Bobby a ride the rest of the way home, because that was where Bobby was walking to when they stopped him. And so Lewis climbed into the back seat, Morton stayed in the driver's seat, and Bobby climbed inside and sat in the front seat. And then once those two were situated, Morton pulled away from the curb and began driving towards Bobby's house. And as they were driving to Bobby's house, Bobby just kind of continued talking about this tennis racket because that was the thing they were talking about. And as he was mid-sentence, Lewis from the back seat reached into his pocket, pulled out a chisel and then lunged forward and began smashing Bobby in the back of the head over and over again with this chisel. And as Bobby is screaming in pain and trying to protect himself, Lewis lunges forward, grabs Bobby, drags him into the back seat, and then holds him down, pulls a rag out of his pocket, and jams it into Bobby's throat. And then he closes Bobby's mouth and holds it shut until Bobby goes still. After that, Lewis kind of grimaced at all of Bobby's blood all over him, and he kind of pushed Bobby down onto the floorboards below, and then Lewis calmly climbed back into the front seat and sat down, and meanwhile, Morton has not remotely reacted to what's just happened. This is just business as usual. Morton and Lewis did not go to Bobby's house, but instead drove towards Indiana. And on their drive to Indiana, they would stop at a roadside restaurant and eat hot dogs and root beers with their car parked right near this restaurant with Bobby's body just totally exposed laying out on the floorboards of the back seat. Morton and Lewis would eventually get into Indiana, and they would head to this particular forest that Morton was familiar with because he was a bird watcher and often came out here. And when they got to this forest, they parked in this clearing, they got out, they checked on Bobby and confirmed that he was dead. So they pulled him out, they stripped all of his clothes off of him, they rolled him up in a rug, and then they dragged him over to this drainage pipe that sat underneath some railroad tracks in this swampy area, and they jammed him inside of it. And then they got back in their car, they drove back to Chicago, at which point Morton called Bobby's mother, Flora, and informed her that her son was kidnapped but alive, even though he wasn't, and don't call the police, we'll be in touch soon. That night, Morton and Lewis would burn all of the clothes they had stripped off of Bobby. They would also clean the interior of their Willis Knight rental car, and then they would play a game of cards together before going to bed. The next day, May 22nd, so the same day that police began their quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping, Morton and Lewis would send that letter to Jacob and Flora demanding $10,000 for the safe return of Bobby. But unfortunately, before Lewis and Morton could claim their ransom money, Bobby's body was discovered. In fact, that day he was discovered. A walker was cutting through the woods in Indiana and saw Bobby in the pipe. And so when Morton and Lewis realized that, the jig is up, the family's never going to pay for their son because he's dead, they just returned their Willis Knight rental car and went back to their normal lives as if nothing had ever happened. But unbeknownst to him, Morton had accidentally dropped his eyeglasses right next to Bobby's body when they dumped him in the woods in Indiana. And Morton's eyeglasses were very unique. In fact, there was only one store in the world that sold this particular kind of eyeglasses. And so when detectives got the call about Bobby's body being found, they would also find these glasses. And that was the big clue, because these glasses led detectives to the store where they were sold, and the owner of the store was able to say that, yep, those particular glasses were sold to Morton. And when detectives went to Morton, Morton immediately pointed the finger at Lewis, saying that Morton didn't do anything to Bobby, Lewis did. But about a week later, on May 31st, both Morton and Lewis would confess to police that they murdered Bobby. But far more shocking than what Morton and Lewis had done was who they were, because Morton and Lewis were not their real names. The two men who killed Bobby Franks were rich kids just like Bobby who lived in South Kenwood. They created two fake names, Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason, and then they booked room 1031 at the Morrison Hotel. Now, they had no intention of actually staying at this hotel, and so they just left that suitcase full of books inside of the room to make it appear like they were staying there. But in reality, the only reason they booked that room is they needed a physical mailing address that was connected to their fake personas. And so after booking this room, they began sending mail to Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason at the Morrison Hotel, room 1031. And then after collecting that mail, which served as a sort of proof of legal name and address, they were able to open a bank account in Chicago. They dumped some money into that, and then again, they used their proof of legal name and address to rent that Willis Knight car, and then used money from their phony bank account to pay for it. And then once they had their luxury car, it was time to go kill. In reality, Morton was actually a 19-year-old prodigy named Nathan Leopold. He spoke 5 languages, he had already graduated from college, and he was a nationally respected ornithologist, which is someone who studies birds. Nathan's IQ was so high, it literally couldn't be measured. His father was the president of a very successful steamship company, and Nathan was planning to attend Harvard University in the fall to get yet another college degree. And Lewis was actually 18-year-old Richard Loeb, who was Bobby's cousin and one of his best friends. Bobby and Richard played tennis together all the time in Richard's private court, which is where Bobby's father went first to go looking for his son. Like Nathan, Richard was also a genius. He was the youngest person ever to have graduated from the University of Michigan. He graduated at 17 years old. And to celebrate the occasion, Richard's father, who in today's dollars was worth about $175 million, he was a retired vice president for the major retail store Sears, he bought Richard a custom golf course. He built him his own golf course. That was his graduation present. And at the time of Bobby's murder, Richard was actually enrolled at the University of Chicago's law school, studying to become a lawyer. Nathan and Richard would very proudly tell investigators that they didn't kill Bobby to get money out of his parents. Nathan and Richard were fabulously wealthy. The money meant nothing. Instead, they had come up with this scheme and killed Bobby because of their belief in the philosopher Nietzsche's concept of supermen. Men whose superiority allows them to rise above all ordinary rules, ethics, and laws. Basically, Nathan and Richard believed they were so much better than everybody else in the world that if they wanted to kill someone, they should be able to. And Bobby seemed like a pretty easy target. After Nathan and Richard confessed, they were put under arrest, but a chauffeur was allowed to come to the police station and drop off silk pajamas for them to wear in custody, and instead of being held in a cell, they were allowed to stay in a hotel. But ultimately, they both were sentenced to life in prison. Bobby's family never recovered from his murder, and his father, Jacob, would die just 4 years after his son died. As for Nathan, he would be murdered in prison in 1936 by another inmate, and as for Richard, he would serve his time and get paroled, and then die of natural causes in 1971. Today, the murder of Bobby Franks is often referred to as the crime of the century. Saturday, April 25th, 1987, was a beautiful spring day in the mountains of northwest Montana. It was exactly the kind of day that 40-year-old Charles Gibbs and his wife Glenda had been waiting for months. The sky was clear, the sun was bright, and the breeze was warm. And so, at around 9 a.m. that morning, Charles and Glenda had a quick breakfast inside of their house in the rural city of Libby, and then they started stuffing their backpacks full of their hiking equipment. Charles and Glenda were going to go to Glacier National Park, which is a 1 million acre wilderness preserve with alpine meadows, forests, rivers, and lakes that are so bright and crystal blue, they almost look like they're glowing. The park is ringed by snow-covered mountains, and it's dotted with glaciers, which are huge masses of pure ice that jut up out of the rock and make you feel like you've stumbled onto some ancient frozen planet. The park is actually so otherworldly that when Hollywood producers were looking for a location to shoot the heaven scene in the big movie What Dreams May Come, they chose Glacier National Park as their location. And for Charles and Glenda, this place practically was heaven. It was the place they went all the time to go hiking, especially on beautiful sunny spring days. After packing all of their gear, Charles and Glenda made their way out the front door and began heading to their car, when as they were walking, Charles suddenly stopped short, shook his head, turned around, and ran back inside the house. When he came back out again, he was carrying his camera bag, and so he ran over to the car, he sat down in the driver's seat, and he grinned at his wife, and he held up the bag, and he said, "Now we're ready." Both Charles and Glenda worked for the public schools in Libby. Glenda was an elementary school teacher, and Charles drove a school bus. But like a lot of people who lived in Montana, their real passion was the outdoors. And for Charles specifically, his real passion was wildlife photography. He was actually a pretty accomplished amateur photographer. He'd had a couple of photo exhibits locally, and he'd gotten a few of his pictures published in the local newspaper. But what Charles really wanted to do with his photography was get one of his wildlife pictures published in a weekly publication called the Hungry Horse News. The Hungry Horse News was a tiny publication, but they had won a Pulitzer Prize, which is the highest award for American journalism. And the Hungry Horse News was famous for its nature photography. Charles had been submitting his work for years to the Hungry Horse News, but the editor kept rejecting them, telling Charles that his photos were totally beautiful, but they weren't dynamic enough. Nothing was happening in these photos. And so that morning, on the couple's drive to Glacier National Park, Charles began talking out loud to Glenda about what strategy he was going to use for his photographs during their hike. You know, what route they were going to be on and what was the best angle to take certain pictures. And as Glenda listened to Charles, she just smiled to herself because it was like no matter how many times Charles got shot down by the Hungry Horse News, she knew he was never going to give up. And so she loved his determination and just unflappable attitude about his craft. At around 11 a.m., Charles and Glenda pulled off the highway and began heading towards the trailhead where they would start their hike that day, which was located at the base of Elk Mountain on the southern border of the park. The route they had chosen for that day was not one of the most popular at the park, and the reason for that was the trail was really steep, and in certain parts of it, it was fairly overgrown, and so really only the most hardcore hikers would go up this trail, of which there weren't that many. And so Charles and Glenda were used to being on this trail and seeing no one, but they preferred it that way. They loved being alone out in nature. Finally, they reached the gravel parking lot right at the trailhead, and Charles parked their car, and then he and Glenda hopped out. They grabbed their bags and then began walking on this trail. The first mile of this trail brought the couple out along an abandoned road, and then over some railroad tracks, and then out into this beautiful field full of white flowers. And then the trail really started to get difficult because it basically went straight up the side of a mountain. And as they walked up this really steep part of the trail, Charles was nonstop taking pictures of everything he saw. There were deer and mountain goats, and at some point the couple reached a clearing on this steep section where they could look down and see a lake, and they saw there were beavers hard at work building a dam. And so of course, Charles got a picture of that too. Now, these were the days before digital photography, and so all these pictures that Charles was taking, he couldn't actually see. He needed to go home and develop the film to see if anything he took was worth keeping. But as Charles and Glenda continued their hike up this mountain, Charles was getting more and more excited about some of the shots he was getting. He felt like they were going to be really, really good, and Hungry Horse News was going to finally accept his work. The couple made it to the summit of this trail by early afternoon, and from up there, they had this beautiful panoramic view of all these jagged mountaintops that were covered in snow, separated by these huge valleys and prairies, and Charles and Glenda were the only ones up there, and so they had this unbelievable view all to themselves. And so the couple would eat the lunch that they brought with them while sitting on this rocky outcropping, kind of looking out over this stunning view. And then when they were done, they packed up their stuff and began heading back down because they knew they wanted to get off of this trail and out of the park before sundown. It was just about 5 p.m. when Charles and Glenda had reached the final slope of this steep section of the trail, and they were getting closer and closer to that big open field with the white flowers. And as they're going down this last section of steepness, Charles suddenly grabs Glenda and stops her and puts his fingers to his lips and then turns around and points behind him. Charles was visibly excited about whatever he was pointing at, but when Glenda looked in the direction he was pointing, she couldn't see anything, but she obviously knew that whatever he was pointing at, Charles wanted to take a picture of it. Now, Glenda by this point was really tired from the hiking and just wanted to go back to the car and go home. I mean, after all, Charles had taken dozens and dozens of pictures that day. Like, we don't need to get one more. And so Glenda would look at Charles impatiently, basically suggesting, like, come on, we can come back another time. But Charles didn't budge, and he looked at her like, please, I want to get one more photo. And so Glenda kind of did one of these and was like, okay. And Charles said, thank you, I'll meet you at the car. And so Glenda stood there and watched as her husband got his camera out, turned around, and began slowly making his way back up the trail. And again, Glenda's looking. She can't see what he's going to take a picture of, but she figured, he had his plan. And Glenda, she turned around and began heading back down towards the car. It didn't take long for Glenda to get back to the car. She got there right around 6 p.m. And when she got there, she hopped inside, sat in the front passenger seat, turned on the radio, and then she expected to have to wait for maybe another 20 minutes or so for Charles to finish up and come join her. But Glenda, after sitting in the car, was so tired that she accidentally fell asleep. And when she woke up again, she was kind of disoriented, and immediately she looked to see if her husband was in the car with her, and he wasn't. And she's looking outside, it's getting pretty dark out. She glanced at her watch, it was 7 p.m., which means Charles had left her for at least an hour by this point. And she's thinking, there's no way Charles would have been gone for an hour. He would never do that. He would never leave me alone like that. And so Glenda began glancing around her, kind of half expecting to see Charles just outside of their car, doing something, but she was all alone. There was no other hikers or cars. Charles wasn't there. And so starting to panic, Glenda got out of her car and began hustling back onto the trail to go look for Charles. And so she's yelling for Charles, she's looking around, it's getting darker and darker, and there's no sign of Charles. He's not calling back to her, it's just totally silent. She walks along the abandoned road, she reaches the railroad tracks, she gets into that meadow with the white flowers, and still there's no sign of Charles. And she gets to the base of that steep section of the trail, and she's looking up at all these trees and how dark it was getting, and she's thinking to herself, if Charles is in trouble somewhere up there, there's no way I can help him by myself in the dark with no equipment, no one knows I'm here. I mean, this is an emergency and I need help. And so Glenda would scream a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing any response, she turned and ran all the way back to her car. She turned it on and she drove to the nearest ranger station. When she got there, she ran inside and immediately told the ranger where her and Charles had been, which trail they were on, and where roughly they were on this trail when she had gone to the car and Charles had turned around and gone uphill to take a picture of something. And as Glenda told the ranger all these details about where they were inside of the park, he really started to look worried. And when Glenda was done explaining, he told her that, yes, we need to go right now and look for your husband, but I can't have you on that trail. It's too dangerous. And so this ranger had Glenda wait at the ranger station, and the ranger, by himself, headed back to the trailhead to go looking for Charles. And so the ranger, he gets to the trailhead, he hops out, he's got a rifle and a flashlight, and he begins walking along this trail, and by now, it's dark out. And so he's looking straight ahead with his flashlight and scanning side to side. He's calling out for Charles, and he's walking this trail. He gets all the way across the train tracks, through the meadow, and he gets to the steep section, and he actually begins going up this part of the trail until roughly the area where Glenda had described Charles going one way and her going back down. And when he got there, there was no sign of Charles, and so the ranger just took his rifle and fired 3 shots into the air, hoping that that might get Charles, if he was in the area, to hear him and call out or do something to indicate where he had gone. But after firing his gun, the ranger heard nothing. By this point, it was approaching midnight, it was totally pitch black outside, and the ranger knew that at this point, Charles was missing, and they really needed to organize a true search party to try to find him. But they would have to do that the next morning when they had light again. And so the ranger called out a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing anything, he reluctantly turned around and made his way back to his truck and drove back to the ranger station, where he would tell Glenda that he could not find her husband and they would now have to wait for sunrise. At sunrise the next morning, 20 searchers arrived at the trailhead where Charles and Glenda had been, and these searchers had dogs, and all the dogs had Charles's scent from some clothes that was in Glenda's car. And so this big search team very slowly and methodically began moving down this trail. And so they went across the abandoned road, over the train tracks, through the meadow with the white flowers. They got to the steep section of the trail, and they got all the way up to that point where Charles and Glenda had separated, and Charles had gone uphill to do whatever he was going to do. And it was at that point on the steep section that one of the searchers' dogs picked up Charles's scent and took off running uphill. And the searcher, whose dog this was, took off running after the dog. And the dog, it went up for a little while, up the steep rocky outcropping, and then it turned and began going down again until it reached a different meadow. So not the same one they walked through with the white flowers. This was farther away to the right. And in this meadow, the dog, who still very much had the scent, began to slow down, and it went straight for this tree. It was kind of a standalone tree right at the base of this steep section. And this tree had low hanging branches, maybe 5 feet off the ground, and the dog went right up to the tree, and then it stopped for a second, and the searcher by this point had caught up to the dog, and so he's looking at this tree, and he sees the ground looks really disturbed, and there's deep gouges in this tree, and then the dog went around this tree and sprinted another 50 feet or so, and then stopped, like it had found something. And when the searcher caught up to his dog, he looked down and he found what they feared the most. It was Charles, and he was deceased. His body was totally mangled. His arms and legs were eaten away. There were deep cuts and gouges all over his body, and there was a blood trail from Charles all the way back to this tree. Also, just a few feet from Charles's outstretched hand was a camera, Charles's camera. Now, it was obvious that something horrific had happened to Charles, and there were clear signs of a struggle that took place near this tree, and then also over here where he was found, there were clear marks on the ground that there was some sort of fight that happened right here. But interestingly, Charles was carrying a gun, but it appeared that he did not unholster it and he didn't fire it. Instead, it almost looked like whatever was happening to Charles, he refused to put his camera down, which is why it was so close to his hand when he finally died. And so it was decided that the only way to determine what happened to Charles would be to develop his camera, to figure out what he was taking pictures of before he died. And so authorities would send off Charles's camera roll to be developed. And 2 weeks later, when they got it back, they couldn't believe what they saw. The photos very clearly told the story of what happened to Charles. This is what happened after Charles left his wife on that trail. When Charles stopped his wife and signaled to her that he wanted to take one more picture up the trail, he had found a photographic opportunity of a lifetime. The warm spring weather that had drawn Charles and Glenda out of their house to Glacier National Park had also woken the grizzly bears in the park from their hibernation. And what Charles had seen up the trail was a mother grizzly bear and her 3 cubs. The first few photographs that Charles would take of these bears were shot from a good distance away, and it just showed the mother bear and her 3 babies just kind of sauntering around the rocks, not really paying any attention to Charles. To Charles, grizzly bears were the most majestic creatures in nature. He didn't just love them, he viewed them as if they were sort of magical in some way. He was always going to local town meetings to speak about grizzly bears' beauty, and we needed to defend their natural habitat. As such, anyone who knew Charles knew about his passion for grizzlies. And while of course Charles knew that grizzly bears were dangerous, he also thought that the bears, who were very smart and sensitive, could sense his own very gentle and protective feelings towards them, and so if he was around them, they would never perceive him as a threat. Charles had taken some very good photos of other bears, black bears, but he had never taken what he called the definitive grizzly bear photo. And it was going to be this definitive grizzly photo of the mother and her 3 cubs that would finally get him a spot in the Hungry Horse News publication. As Charles took more and more photos of these bears, you could see in the photos that Charles was getting closer and closer and closer to this mother bear and her cubs. It was obvious that he was tracking them, even as the mother bear and the cubs were clearly trying to walk away from him. Finally, when Charles got about 50 feet away from this family of grizzly bears, he must have kicked a rock or stepped on a twig that broke that startled the bears. And so the second to last photo that Charles would take of this family shows the mother bear very clearly turning around to look at Charles, and she's making perfect eye contact with him, as is one of her cubs. Charles would take one more photo, and in this photo you can see the bears are not just staring at Charles, they are running towards him. They are charging him. and it was likely after taking this photo that Charles realized the danger he was in. At this point, Charles tried to make a run for it by running down the side of this mountain. He got down to that tree with the low-hanging limbs, and he attempted to climb up into it, maybe hoping he could get one more picture of this bear if they would just leave him alone. But the mother bear and her cubs, they came charging down. They saw him up in the tree, and the mother bear began climbing into the tree, and she reached Charles. Now, she likely weighed about 400 pounds, and when mother grizzly bears are defending their young, they are absolutely merciless. And so she must have grabbed him or bit onto him and yanked him from the tree. And Charles somehow, after being pulled to the ground and getting slashed and bit by this bear, he managed to break away from her, as we can tell from the blood trail, and he made it about 50 feet away from this tree before the bear chased him down again, jumped on top of him, and killed him. When authorities figured out that Charles had managed to briefly get away from this mother grizzly bear and made it 50 feet away from her, they wondered why he hadn't pulled out his gun and shot at the bears to defend himself. But Charles's wife, Glenda, said it made perfect sense that Charles had not tried to harm this grizzly bear or her cubs. He loved grizzly bears, and he would never dream of leaving these 3 cubs without their mother. After Charles's death, the rangers did not attempt to track down this bear and her cubs and do anything to the bears, because they felt like the bears were just acting like bears, and it was Charles who was in the wrong. And Charles's family and friends would say that is a decision that Charles would definitely support. Charles's photos of the grizzly bear family were published in the Hungry Horse News alongside an article about his death.